The moment Lucy Lawson walked into the sheriff's office in Dry Creek, Texas, covered in trail dust, with a black eye and a pistol tucked into the waistband of her trousers, every man in that room went very, very quiet. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Dry Creek sat baking under a merciless West Texas sun like a forgotten biscuit in a cast-iron skillet. The town was modest, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a livery, a church, and the sheriff's office, which smelled permanently of burnt coffee and old leather. Deputy Frank Turner sat behind the desk when Lucy walked in, because Sheriff Cal Briggs had ridden out that morning to deal with a dispute over water rights on the Kendall Ranch, and Frank had been left holding everything together, which was not unusual. Frank had been holding things together in Dry Creek for 3 years running. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark brown eyes that always seemed to be reading something nobody else could see, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same rock as the West Texas bluffs. He had a habit of staying calm in situations that made other men reach for their guns, and people appreciated that quality in a deputy. He was not flashy, not given to boasting, and he had never once in 3 years caused a scene in the saloon, which was a near miracle in Dry Creek. So when this woman walked through the door dusty, bruised, dark-haired, and entirely unashamed of any of it, Frank set down his coffee cup and gave her his full attention without making it look like anything special. "You the deputy?" Lucy asked, and her voice had an edge to it that said she had been talking to people who disappointed her all day, and she was giving him one chance before she revised her opinion entirely. "I am," Frank said. "Frank Turner, can I help you, miss?" "Mrs.," she said. "Or no, not anymore." She stopped, looked at the ceiling briefly, and then looked back at him. "Lucy Lawson, my husband died 4 months ago. I have his land claim up in the Creston Hills, about 12 miles northeast of here, and 3 men have moved onto that property and are running their cattle across it like they own it. I went out there to ask them to leave. One of them hit me in the face." She pointed to the black eye with one finger, very matter-of-factly. "I took his horse and I rode here." Frank studied her. "You took his horse?" "He hit me," she said, as though this explained everything, which, when he thought about it, it really did. "And you rode all the way from the Creston Hills on a stolen horse?" "Borrowed," she said. "I will return it after you have arrested him, and he no longer needs it immediately." Frank stood up slowly, because he had learned early in his time as a deputy that you moved slowly when a situation was still being understood, and this situation was very much still being understood. He was a tall man, and he was used to people making some unconscious adjustment when he stood to his full height, but Lucy Lawson looked at him with the exact same expression she had been wearing since she walked in. Steady, unimpressed, waiting. "Who are these men?" he asked. "The one who hit me is named Cord Vance. The other 2 I only heard called Deke and Red. They have about 40 head of cattle on my land, and they are running a line of fence across the eastern boundary that cuts off access to the creek." Frank knew the name Cord Vance. Most people in and around Dry Creek knew that name. Vance ran a loose operation out of a camp near the edge of county, and he was the kind of man who spent his life locating the exact boundary between what was technically illegal and what could be argued in front of a judge, and operating there with great confidence. He had not, as far as Frank knew, hit any widows recently, but the day was apparently not yet done producing surprises. "All right," Frank said. "I'm going to ride out there. You are going to stay in town." "I am going with you," Lucy said. Mrs. Lawson," she said, "and I am going with you. That is my land. I know where the claim markers are and you do not. Additionally," she added, reaching back and adjusting the pistol in her waistband with the casual ease of someone who had been carrying a gun for a very long time, "I can handle myself." Frank looked at the pistol. He looked at her face. He looked at the door, then back at her. "Have you ever fired that gun at a person?" he asked. "Not today," she said. It was such a completely honest answer that Frank almost laughed. He did not, but the corner of his mouth moved just slightly, in a way that Lucy noticed. She noticed everything. They rode out within the hour, Frank on his gray gelding, Smoke and Lucy on the borrowed horse, a thick-necked brown with a bad disposition, which she managed with an ease that suggested she had handled worse. Frank had assumed, from the way she'd said she took the horse rather than that she rode the horse, that maybe she was not particularly experienced in the saddle. He revised that opinion about 3 minutes out of town. She rode like she had grown up doing it, though there was something slightly unconventional about her posture. She sat forward, confident, aggressive almost, like she was always ready to push the animal faster. "You said they moved the fence to cut off the creek access," Frank said as they rode. "How long ago?" "I found out about it 6 weeks ago when I went up to check the property. My neighbor, Mr. Guthrie, has the claim to the north, and he wrote me a letter about it. I came as soon as I could get transport arranged from San Antonio." "You were in San Antonio." "I was settling my husband's business affairs. He was a trader. We lived in San Antonio. The land claim was—" She paused. "It was something he always meant to do something with, and now it is mine and I intend to do something with it." "What kind of something?" Frank asked. She looked at him sideways like she was deciding whether the question was too personal. Then she seemed to decide it was not. "I want to run horses," she said. "Not cattle, horses. The land is good for it, there is water, there is grass in the creek bed, and the hills provide wind shelter in the winter. I know horses. I grew up around them." She paused again. She stopped. Frank waited. "I have not actually had much time to learn how to do everything that a person is supposed to know how to do if they intend to run land alone," she said. And she said it with a kind of brisk admission, like she was filing a report on herself. "My mother was not, she did not keep house in the traditional way, and my husband had household staff. So I do not cook particularly well, and I cannot sew more than a button, and I had a horse trainer on staff at the ranch in San Antonio, so mostly I watched and learned but did not do the daily management myself." Frank looked at her. "You can't cook." "I can heat things," she said, "if they are already prepared." "You can't sew." "I can sew a button. I mentioned that." "And you were raised around horses, but you said—" "I said I do not have the practical experience of the daily management. I know horses. I can evaluate a horse, I can recognize illness, I can understand temperament. I just have not personally mucked a stall in recent years." She looked at him directly now, and her chin was up and her eyes had a challenge in them. "I am aware that this is an incomplete skill set for what I am proposing. I am also aware that I am 26 years old and I have been a widow for 4 months, and I have had exactly 2 people tell me this is a good idea, which is one of my sisters and my late husband's lawyer, who was mostly just surprised I had a plan at all." Frank was quiet for a moment. Smoke moved steadily beneath him, and the West Texas landscape rolled out in every direction, gold and rust and pale blue sky above. "Can you fight?" he asked. She blinked. It was the first time she had blinked with any kind of surprise since she walked through his office door. "What?" "You walked into my office with a black eye and a stolen horse and a pistol," Frank said. "And you told me right off that you can handle yourself, so I am asking, can you fight?" "Yes," she said, and there was no hesitation in it at all. "Good," Frank said simply, "because I need someone who can fight more than I need someone who can sew." Lucy looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them, carrying dust and the distant smell of cedar. "That is the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "Probably," Frank agreed. "But I mean it." She turned her eyes back to the trail, and Frank watched her profile for just a second before he did the same. He told himself he was just reading the terrain. He was not entirely sure that was true. They reached the Lawson claim in the late afternoon, and Cord Vance was exactly where Lucy had said he would be, camped near the creek with his 2 men and his 40 head of cattle, and the new fence line cutting across the property like a scar. Vance was a big man, broad and sun-leathered, with a mustache that he clearly took some pride in and eyes that were the pale, flat color of a winter sky. He saw Frank's deputy badge and adjusted his expression into something cooperative, without adjusting anything else about his posture, which Frank clocked immediately as the particular brand of calculation that meant A man thought he had angles to play. "Deputy," Vance said, standing up from where he'd been crouching near the fire. His two men, Deke, who was wiry and nervous, and Red, who was just a kid really, maybe 20, who looked like he had made several poor decisions recently and was beginning to understand the cumulative weight of them, stayed where they were. "Cord," Frank said. He did not get off his horse, which was also intentional. "You need to move your cattle, pull your fence, and clear off this property." "Now, Deputy, I have been looking at the land office records, and there is a question about whether the claim on this parcel is still legally current, on account of the holder being deceased and the transfer." "The transfer is legal," Lucy said from beside Frank. She had a leather satchel over her shoulder that Frank had not noticed her take from the saddlebag, and she produced from it a folded document with the kind of efficiency that said she had been expecting to need it. "This is a certified copy of the deed transfer, filed in Bixar County and registered with the Garza County Land Office. The original is with my lawyer in San Antonio. This land belongs to me, Mr. Vance, and you know it, which is why you hit me this morning instead of showing me your own documentation." Vance's jaw tightened. He looked at the document she was holding out toward him, and then he looked at Frank, and then he looked back at Lucy with something in his expression that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but was traveling in the direction of the second while pretending to be going somewhere else. "You have until tomorrow morning to move your cattle and that fence," Frank said. "If you are still here tomorrow morning, I will be coming back with the sheriff and a warrant, and you will be explaining your business to Judge Harlan in Carson City, who I happen to know has very little patience for disputed land claims after 11 in the morning." Vance stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Lucy. "You are going to have a real interesting time trying to work this land alone, Mrs. Lawson," he said, and it was not a threat exactly, but it was in the neighborhood. "Mr. Vance," Lucy said pleasantly, "I was managing quite well before you arrived, and I took your horse this morning without breaking a sweat, so I am going to go ahead and take my chances." Red, the young one, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Deke elbowed him. Frank and Lucy rode back without the stolen horse, because Frank had insisted that returning it was the right thing to do, even though Lucy had argued that Vance owed her more than a horse for the inconvenience. And Frank had said that was probably true, but it was still the law, and she had given him a look that expressed both agreement and personal disagreement at the same time, which was a look he found quite remarkable. When they reached the edge of town, the sun was low and painting everything orange and copper, and Dry Creek looked, for about 15 minutes of every day, like it could be beautiful. "You should stay at the boarding house tonight," Frank said. "Mrs. Holt runs it. She is a decent woman. Breakfast is early." "I know," Lucy said. "I stayed there last night before I walked out to the property this morning." Frank had not known that. He was not sure why it surprised him. "And when Vance is gone," he said, "what will you do?" "Go back to the property," she said. "There is a house, though it needs work, and I need to find someone who knows the area and can help me understand what I am getting into." She paused. "Someone who is not going to tell me I should sell and go back east." Frank nodded slowly. "I know a man named Hector Reyes. He worked horse ranching for 12 years out near the Davis Mountains before he came to Dry Creek. He is looking for work. He is honest and he knows what he is doing." Lucy looked at him. "How do you know all the people in this town so well?" "It is a small town," Frank said, "and I pay attention." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you, Deputy Turner." "Frank," he said, and he was not entirely sure why he said it except that it felt right. She nodded just once and rode on toward the boarding house without looking back, and Frank sat on smoke and watched her go, and then told himself to stop watching her go, and rode toward the livery instead. That night Frank sat on the porch outside the boarding house, not because it was the most natural place for a deputy to sit on a Tuesday evening, but because he had walked past on his evening rounds, and then, for reasons he did not fully examine, had not kept walking. He sat on the step and looked at the stars and thought about the Lawson claim and the fence and Cord Vance's flat, pale eyes, and he was telling himself very firmly that these were the things he was thinking about. Lucy came out about an hour later. She had cleaned up, her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was carrying 2 tin cups. She handed him one without asking if he wanted it and sat down on the step beside him. "Mrs. Holt makes good coffee," Lucy said. "She does," Frank agreed. They sat in silence for a moment. Above them, the Texas sky was so full of stars it seemed almost impossible, the kind of sky that reminded you the universe was very large and you were very small, and somehow, strangely, this was comforting in the right company. "My husband was a good man," Lucy said, and Frank did not say anything, because he could hear that there was more coming and that what came needed space. Was 20 years older than me, and we had a practical arrangement more than a passionate one, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. He was kind and fair, and he supported my ideas even when he did not always understand them. But he did not, we were not, she stopped. He left me well provided for and free, and I am grateful for that. Frank held his coffee with both hands. "How long were you married?" "4 years, she said. "I was 22 when we married. He was 42. Frank said nothing about the age gap, though he noted it. 22 and 42 was a wide stretch of years, and people made those arrangements for all sorts of reasons in 1878, and none of them were simple. "You said you want to run horses," Frank said. "Yes. It is hard work by yourself." "I know it is hard work," she said, with a patience that said she had been having that exact conversation many times recently. "I am not afraid of hard work. I am afraid of not having enough information, which is different. Hard work I can do. Knowing what I do not know, that is the part I need help with." Frank looked at the stars. "Hector Reyes, first thing tomorrow I will introduce you." "You would do that?" He looked at her then, sideways in the dark. "Why wouldn't I?" She looked back at him, and in the starlight her eyes were very dark and very direct. "Because most men in your position would tell me to sell the land and go back to the city. You have not said that once." "That is because it is not my business to tell you what to do with your land," Frank said. "And because," he stopped, thought, "because you did not look like someone who needed to be told to go back to the city when you walked into my office today. You looked like someone who needed to be pointed in the right direction and then left alone to get there." Lucy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the second strangest thing you have said to me today." Frank smiled, and this time he let it be a full smile instead of just the corner of his mouth. "I imagine there will be more." And she laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, and it changed her face entirely, made it younger and warmer and entirely different from the woman who had walked into his office that morning covered in dust and certainty. Frank filed that laugh away somewhere important without meaning to. They said good night shortly after, and Frank walked his rounds and thought about nothing in particular, which was how he knew he was thinking about something very specific. In the morning, Cord Vance was gone. Frank rode out to confirm it before breakfast, and found the fence posts pulled, the cattle moved, and the ashes of the camp fire already cold. Lucy's land was clear. He sent word to her at the boarding house and then went to find Hector Reyes. Hector was a compact, careful man in his early 40s with a graying mustache and the kind of calm that came from having handled horses and difficult situations for a very long time. He was sitting outside the livery when Frank found him, mending tack with the methodical attention of a man who took every task seriously regardless of its size. Frank explained the situation. Hector listened without interrupting, which Frank appreciated. Then Hector said, "A woman rancher." "A woman rancher," Frank confirmed. "Horse ranch, her goal, yes." Hector considered this. "Is she serious, or is she going to get out to that property and decide it is too much?" "She is serious," Frank said. "I am sure of it." Hector looked at him with an expression that said he found Frank's certainty interesting for some reason. "I will talk to her," he said. The meeting between Lucy and Hector took place over breakfast at the boarding house, and Frank sat at the end of the table and mostly stayed quiet, which was unusual enough that Mrs. Holt gave him 2 extra helpings of scrambled eggs out of what seemed like concern. Lucy and Hector talked for an hour about water, about pasture rotation, about the market for horses in West Texas in 1878, which was considerable, because the railroad was expanding and the army was always buying, and good horse stock was never short on buyers, about the condition of the existing structures on the claim, about winter preparation and what supplies she would need before November. Frank watched Lucy through the whole conversation. He watched her listen, which was the more interesting part. She listened the way people listened when they were actually absorbing information rather than just waiting for their own turn to speak again. She asked good questions, which told him about what she already understood, and she took notes on a small piece of paper with a short pencil, which told him she was practical. And when Hector said something she disagreed with, she said so, clearly and without apology, and then explained her reasoning. And twice Hector revised his position after hearing her out, which was a thing that Hector Reyes almost never did, because Hector Reyes was very confident in his expertise. By the end of the hour, Hector said he would take the work, and they agreed on his wages, and Lucy shook his hand firmly and looked satisfied in a way that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Frank walked her outside after. The morning was cool and bright, the way October mornings in West Texas could be when the night had swept the dust out and replaced it with something cleaner. "Good?" he asked. "Good," she said, and then looking at him, "You knew he was exactly right for this." "I thought he would be." "How did you know?" Frank put his hat back on and squinted at the sky. "Because you two approach problems the same way, head-on and with information. That either becomes a conflict or a collaboration. I thought collaboration was more likely." Lucy was looking at him with that steady, evaluating look again, the one she had given him in his office. "You read people," she said. "Very well." "Deputy's job," he said. "No," she said. "It is not. Most deputies I have ever encountered read situations for threats. You read people for everything else, for what they need." She paused. "It is a different thing." Frank did not know what to say to that, which was unusual for him, so he looked at the street and said, "When do you plan to move out to the property?" "Tomorrow," Lucy said. "Hector is going to meet me there." She hesitated. Would you come?" "Just to make sure Vance has truly cleared out, and to see if there is anything that should be reported to the sheriff." "Of course," Frank said, and he said it easily, without examining too carefully why it felt so natural to say. The property was 12 miles northeast, as Lucy had said, and riding out there with her and Hector in the pale October morning, with the hills rising around them and the creek shining in the distance, Frank understood why her husband had filed the claim. It was genuinely good land. The house was small and needed repair. A window was broken, the porch had a rotting plank, and the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. But the bones of it were sound, and the creek ran clear, and the pasture land spread out in a way that would be generous to horses in particular, with varied terrain that would make for strong, sure-footed animals. Lucy walked the property with Hector while Frank checked the perimeter for any remaining sign of Vance's camp. He found nothing but flattened grass where the cattle had been and the holes where the fence posts had stood. He filled in what he could with his boot heel and noted the rest in the small ledger he kept in his coat pocket. When he came back around to the house, Lucy was standing in the doorway looking in, and there was something in her face that was entirely unguarded for just a moment. A kind of longing and determination mixed together, like someone looking at something they wanted very much and intended absolutely to have, but who was also aware of the full weight of that wanting. He stopped at the porch steps and she heard him and turned, and the unguarded look closed up, not disappearing exactly but becoming something more composed. "It is good land," Frank said. "It is," she agreed. "It is very good land," and she looked back at it once more briefly before looking back at him. "I am going to make something real here," she said. "I want you to know that. I do not say things I do not mean." "I know," Frank said. She looked at him with a quick, almost surprised expression. "You have known me for one day." "I know," he said again and smiled. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that Frank only noticed had become a pattern when he was already well inside it. He rode out to the Lawson claim twice a week, initially because he was keeping an eye on the situation with Vance, who had not gone farther than the camp near the county boundary, and whose intentions were therefore still uncertain, and later because there were always things to notice and assess, and because it turned out that 12 miles northeast in the October Hills was a remarkably pleasant ride. Lucy had moved into the house. Hector was out there most days, and they had hired a young man named Billy Carr from town to help with the heavy repair work. The window was fixed, the porch was solid, the door hung true. The fence along the eastern boundary, the legitimate fence, the one that marked the actual claim, was repaired and extended. 2 mares and a gelding appeared on the property in the second week, purchased by Lucy from a rancher in Carson City, with the kind of decisive confidence that suggested she had done exactly this kind of transaction before, which she had. Frank always had a reason to be there. He was checking on the Vance situation. He was following up on a report Mrs. Guthrie had made about cattle crossing the northern boundary. He was delivering a document from the sheriff. And these were all genuine reasons, but they were not the only reason, and he was aware of that with increasing clarity. Lucy made coffee that could be used for emergency tanning, apparently, because she had mentioned she could not cook and she had not been wrong, but she had made coffee in the kitchen of the house with a kind of defiant determination, and it was extremely strong and tasted like ambition, and Frank drank it every time without complaint and actually came to appreciate it. They talked. That was the most straightforward way to say it. They talked in a way that Frank had not talked to anyone in a long time, not with the careful distance of a deputy managing a situation, not with the guarded shorthand of a man who lived alone and had mostly stopped expecting to be understood. Lucy talked to him like a person she was interested in, and she listened like she was genuinely curious about the answers, and he found himself saying things he had not planned to say, which was unsettling in the best possible way. He told her about growing up in Missouri, which was flat and green and nothing like Texas, and how he had come west at 19 with a cousin who subsequently turned around and went home, leaving Frank to figure out the rest himself. He told her about the 3 years in Dry Creek, how he had started as a hired hand at the Crawford Ranch and ended up deputizing for Cal Briggs after stopping a bar fight that had been about to become something worse, and how he had discovered that the work suited him in a way that nothing else had quite managed to. She told him about San Antonio and the trading business and the organized, practical life she had lived as Thomas Lawson's wife, and she talked about it without bitterness, but also without the kind of softening that people used when they wanted to make things sound better than they were. Thomas Lawson had been a decent man. Their marriage had been comfortable and honest and correct. And it had not been, she used the word complete, and then seemed to immediately decide that was too personal a word to have said, and changed the subject, but Frank heard it and held it carefully. In November, Sheriff Cal Briggs sat Frank down in the office and looked at him with the expression of a man who had been watching something develop from a moderate distance and had opinions about it. "You have been out to the Lawson property 6 times this month," Cal said. "There has been ongoing concern about Vance," Frank said. "Vance moved his operation 70 miles west last week," Cal said. "I got word from the Presidio County Sheriff 3 days ago." Frank looked at his coffee. "There are other things to check on." Cal was a big man with a gray beard and the patient, ironic manner of someone who had seen a great many things and was no longer surprised by any of them. "Frank," he said, "I have been married to Clara for 22 years. Go tell the woman how you feel." "I do not know what you are." "Yes, you do," Cal said. "Go tell her." Frank sat with this for approximately 48 hours, which was 2 days of riding his rounds and not riding northeast. And then on the 3rd morning, he saddled Smoke before breakfast and rode out to the Lawson claim in the early frost of a November morning. Because Cal Briggs was right, and also because Frank Turner was tired of waiting to say the things he had been thinking. He arrived to find Lucy on the far side of the property, near the western hill where the fence met the cedar line, and she was standing with her arms crossed and her head tilted, examining one of the mares with the focused expression she used when she was working something out. The mare in question was a roan, young, with a slight favoring of her left foreleg that Lucy had noticed 2 days ago and had been watching. Frank tied Smoke at the post and walked over. "Hector thinks it is just stiffness," Lucy said without turning around, which told him she had heard his horse coming from a distance, which he found impressive. "He is probably right. But I am going to give her another 2 days before I decide." "That sounds sensible," Frank said. She turned then and looked at him. She looked at his face for a moment, reading it the way he usually read other people, and something shifted in her expression, a kind of awareness, careful and still. "You did not ride out here to look at my horse," she said. "No," he said. The morning was very still around them. The hills were pale gold and rust, and the frost was just lifting from the grass, and somewhere in the cedar trees a bird was making its autumn sound, small and persistent. "Lucy," Frank said, and he had rehearsed nothing, which was unusual for him, and he found that he did not mind. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean either, so what I am about to say I mean." She waited, arms still crossed, face composed, but her dark eyes were very attentive. "I do not know exactly when it happened," he said, "but somewhere between you walking into my office with a black eye and a stolen horse and right now, I have gone and done something I was not expecting to do, which is that I have fallen fairly completely in love with you, and I am not asking you to feel the same way. I am asking you to know that I do, because you said you value honesty, and so do I, and I cannot keep riding out here twice a week and talking to you like I am not thinking about this every single time." Lucy was very quiet. Frank stood with his hands loose at his sides and watched her face and waited, because waiting was something he was genuinely good at, and this particular wait was the most important one he could remember. "You are not the first man who has expressed interest in me since Thomas died," she said, and she said it carefully. "The first was about 3 weeks after the funeral, which was appalling. The second was Thomas's business partner, who I believe was primarily interested in the assets. The third was a man in Carson City who told me in the first 10 minutes of conversation that I should consider whether the land claim was really something I wanted to take on, given the challenges, and whether perhaps a simpler life might suit me better." She paused. What those 3 men had in common was that none of them were interested in me, in who I am, in what I actually want, in the way that I think or work or move through the world. They were interested in a version of me that would fit neatly into a version of their lives. Frank said nothing. He was listening with everything he had. "You," Lucy said, and her voice was different now, quieter and more careful, "rode out to a piece of land with a woman you did not know, and when she told you she could not cook or sew and her horsemanship skills were theoretical rather than practical, you asked her if she could fight. And then you said," she stopped, pressed her lips together for a moment. "You said you needed someone who could fight more than someone who could sew, and I have thought about that every single day since." "I meant it," Frank said. "I know you did," she said. "That is the thing, I know you did." She uncrossed her arms and she looked at him directly, fully, the way she had looked at him from the first moment, in a way that had never quite let him get comfortable. "I have also been thinking about you every single day since," she said, in case that was unclear. "It was fairly unclear," Frank said honestly. She almost smiled, almost. "I was not ready to say it," she said. "I am saying it now." He closed the distance between them slowly, and he thought she might step back, and she did not. She stood completely still and looked up at him. She was not a short woman, but he was tall, and then he reached out and took her hand, which was cold from the November morning and strong and capable, and held it between both of his. "I would like to come calling properly," he said, "if you would allow it." "You have been coming out here twice a week," she said. "That was professional," he said, and the almost smile became an actual one, small and warm and entirely hers, and Frank thought it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in a very long time. "Then yes," she said, "come calling, properly." He rode back to town with his heart doing something entirely undignified, and he did not care at all. What followed was a courtship conducted largely in the open air, which suited both of them. Frank came out every weekend, and sometimes on a weekday evening if the work permitted, and they rode the property together. He on Smoke, she on a bay mare she had acquired in November and named Cress, because the horse had the same steady temperament as watercress in a creek, whatever that meant, and Lucy had explained it with complete confidence, and he had not quite followed the logic but had understood the affection entirely. He brought her things she needed, not as gifts but as practical assistance, which was how she preferred it. Hardware for the barn repairs, a new set of horseshoes from the farrier in town, a book he had found at the general store about horse breeding in the Southwest, which he had looked at the cover of and thought she would want, and which she had taken from him with an expression that was equal parts pleased and startled that he had thought of it. She fed him dinner when he stayed late, which was an adventure every time and which he approached with genuine enthusiasm, because he found the food interesting regardless of its quality, and she was always trying something new, which meant that even the disasters were different disasters. There was a beef stew in December that had been seasoned with what appeared to be most of the contents of her spice cabinet at once, and he had eaten 2 bowls of it and told her it was bold, which was true in the way that a lightning strike is bold. She looked at him over the table after the second bowl and said, "It is awful, Frank." "It has a strong personality," he said. She laughed, and it was not the short, surprised laugh of their first night on the boarding-house steps but a full one, warm and real, and she covered her face with her hand for a moment, and then looked at him with eyes that were bright. "You are a very good man," she said, which she said simply and without decoration, and it landed in his chest like something solid and warm. Christmas came to Dry Creek with a cold front that rolled in off the plains on the 23rd of December and blew hard for 2 days. Frank rode out on Christmas morning through 6 inches of snow, which was unusual for West Texas, and which made the hills look entirely different, white and strange and beautiful. Lucy was on the porch when he arrived, wrapped in a heavy coat, watching the snow with an expression of wonder that she usually reserved for horses she found particularly impressive. "I have not seen snow in 4 years," she said. "Missouri gets more," Frank said, swinging down from Smoke. "You get used to it." "I do not want to get used to it," she said. "I want to look at it." So they looked at it. They stood on the porch and looked at the white hills and the frozen creek, and the sky the color of pewter, and Frank put his arm around her shoulders because it was cold, and because he had been wanting to for approximately 2 months, and she leaned against him with the naturalness of someone who had been deciding to do that exact thing for approximately the same amount of time. They stood like that for a long while, and then she turned her face up toward him, and he kissed her, which was something he had been thinking about with enough regularity to embarrass himself, and which was entirely worth every moment of waiting. The first kiss was brief and tentative, and then they looked at each other, and the second one was not brief at all. When they came apart, Lucy looked at him with her direct, steady gaze, and her cheeks were pink from the cold and something else, and she said, "That was about time." "I was being proper," Frank said. "You were being cautious," she said. "That too," he admitted. She tucked herself back against his side and they went on looking at the snow, and Frank felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a long time, years. Possibly the particular unsettledness of a man who has been capable and sufficient and alone for so long that he has stopped noticing the alone part. January brought the real work of winter on the property. The horses needed more feed brought in, and the creek iced over at the edges, and there were 3 nights when the temperature dropped low enough that Lucy and Hector stayed up in shifts keeping the barn fire going. Frank helped when he could, and Cal Briggs raised an eyebrow at the increasing frequency of the deputy's absences from town, and then said nothing about it because Frank was efficient enough that the work never suffered, and also because Cal was genuinely pleased about the whole situation and kept this to himself with great discipline. In February, there was an incident. It was the kind of incident that the West produced with some regularity, and that reminded Frank why he did the work he did. A man named Amos Sheed rode through the area with two companions. Sheed had a history with the sheriff's office, not in Dry Creek specifically, but in two adjacent counties, that involved horses disappearing from properties when nobody was watching. He showed up at the Lawson claim on a Tuesday morning when Hector was in town for supplies and Lucy was alone. Frank heard about it when he came out that afternoon. He heard about it because Mrs. Guthrie, the neighbor to the north, had been crossing the hill on her way to check her own fence line, and had seen the three men's horses tied to a post near Lucy's barn, and had noted it as unusual, and mentioned it to Frank when she passed the road. He pushed Smoke into a canter and came down the hill toward the property, and what he found when he arrived was this. Amos Sheed and his two men were standing near the barn, and Lucy was standing between them and the barn door, and she had her pistol in her hand, and it was pointed with great steadiness at Amos Sheed. It was not pointed in a threatening way, exactly. It was pointed in the specific way of someone who is very calm and very certain and wants the other person to have absolutely no doubts about both of these things. "Gentlemen," Frank said, coming off Smoke, "I am Deputy Turner. Is there a problem?" "Your woman pointed a gun at us," Sheed said, and he said it with an injured air like this was the unreasonable part of the situation. "Did she?" Frank said. He looked at Lucy. "Mrs. Lawson, were you invited to point your gun at these men?" "They were looking at my horses," Lucy said, keeping her eyes on Sheed. "And when I asked them their business, Mr. Sheed here told me they were just passing through, which I do not believe because they came from the northeast and my property is not on any through road from the northeast. And then he reached for my fence gate, and I suggested he might want to reconsider that with the assistance of the gun." Frank looked at Sheed. He looked at Sheed's two companions. He looked at their horses, which were good ones, better than drifting men usually rode, and he looked at the brand on the nearest one, which was a Circle K brand, and he thought about where he had seen that brand recently, and he remembered it very clearly. "Where did you get that horse?" Frank asked the companion on the left. The man's eyes moved slightly, and Frank had his answer before the man opened his mouth. It took the better part of an hour to sort out, during which Hector returned from town and stood near the barn with his arms folded, and his expression that of a man who was watching a situation be handled, and was content to let the handling happen. Sheed and his two men were eventually escorted to Dry Creek and turned over to Cal Briggs, who confirmed the Circle K horses as animals stolen from a ranch in Presidio County 2 weeks prior. That evening Frank stayed for supper, and Lucy made scrambled eggs, which was one of the things she could actually cook reliably and which she had been working on adding variations to with mixed results. The eggs were good. There was cheese in them, which was an improvement she had discovered recently and was proud of. "You did exactly right," Frank said. "I know," she said, not with arrogance but with calm fact. "I was not going to let them near those horses." "The gun was the right call," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You assessed the situation, you did not escalate unnecessarily, and you held the position until backup arrived." She looked at him. "You sound like you are writing a report." "I am trying to tell you," he said, setting down his fork, "that what you did today was exactly what I would have told you to do if I had been here to tell you anything, which I was not and which did not matter at all because you knew." Lucy looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight was warm on her face. "Frank," she said. "Yes. I am not going to be a woman who needs to be handled carefully," she said. "I want to be very clear about that. I do not need managing or protecting in the way that people usually mean when they say those things." "I know," he said, "but I would very much like a partner," she said. "Someone who works alongside me. Not in front of me and not behind me, alongside." He met her eyes. "That is exactly the kind of thing I want," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand and held it in that strong, capable grip. Outside, the February wind moved around the eaves of the house, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the lamp burned steadily on the table between them. In March, Frank asked her to marry him. He did it in a way that was entirely characteristic of him, not on bended knee with a rehearsed speech, but rather in the middle of a practical conversation about the coming spring, when she was standing at the barn door watching Cress and the roan mare moving in the morning pasture, and he came up beside her and stood looking at the same thing she was looking at and said, "I want to marry you, Lucy, if you are willing." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Ask me properly." He turned to face her. She turned to face him. He took both her hands. "Lucy Lawson," he said, "I love you. I admire you. I want to spend whatever time I have building something with you, this land, this life, whatever you want to make of it. I am not perfect and I will not always do everything right, but I will always be honest with you and I will always be here. Will you marry me?" She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes, and there was nothing unguarded in her face this time. It was all entirely open, entirely present. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." He put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the March morning with the horses moving in the pasture and the hills spread around them, and the year just beginning to warm. They were married in May, in the church in Dry Creek, which was small and white and needed a coat of paint, but was full of people because Dry Creek was the kind of town where everyone came to weddings and funerals and most things in between. Cal Briggs stood with Frank. Hector Reyes sat in the second row in his best hat. Mrs. Holt from the boarding house cried in a very quiet and dignified way in the third pew. Lucy wore a dress she had bought in Carson City that was the color of the creek in October, a deep blue-green that she had chosen herself with no advice and perfect instinct. She did not sew it herself, and this fact bothered no one, and she walked down the aisle of that small church with her chin up and her eyes on Frank, and the expression on her face was one that Frank would spend the rest of his life being grateful for. The ceremony was short and honest, which was how both of them wanted it. The Reverend was a spare, thoughtful man named Morrison who had been in Dry Creek for 8 years and had a gift for saying exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. He spoke briefly about partnership and honesty, and the particular courage required to choose another person fully and without reservation, and both Frank and Lucy listened to him as though he were saying something specific to them, which, in the best way, he was. When Frank slid the ring onto Lucy's finger, a simple band of silver that he had ordered from a craftsman in Carson City, she looked down at it and then up at him, and her eyes were bright. He kissed her in front of the whole congregation of Dry Creek, which was not common in 1878, and which Cal Briggs applauded, which started everyone else applauding, and Mrs. Holt stopped being quiet about her crying. The reception was held in the church yard, with food brought by what appeared to be everyone in town, which meant there was an enormous and magnificent abundance of things to eat, and nobody asked Lucy to contribute food specifically, which was diplomatic. There was music from 2 fiddles and a banjo, and the evening was warm, and the stars came out over Dry Creek like they were putting on a show. Frank danced with Lucy twice, and then watched her dance with Hector once, which Hector bore with a kind of careful dignity, and then with Billy Carr, who was 21 and terrified of her in the specific way that young men are terrified by women who are entirely sure of themselves, which Lucy found very funny. Later, when the music had slowed and the crowd had thinned, they stood together at the edge of the church yard with glasses of punch that someone had made, and that turned out to have something other than fruit juice in it, which nobody had admitted to. "Well," Lucy said. "Well," Frank agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder in the way she had begun to do recently, comfortable and unhurried. "We are married," she said. "We are," he said. "That is a very large thing," she said. "It is," he agreed. "And tomorrow we will go back to the property and Hector will have left the barn a disaster because he always does when he is not directly supervised. And the Roan's farrier appointment needs to be rescheduled from last week. and you need to have a conversation with Sheriff Briggs about the water rights issue near the northern boundary that has been waiting for 3 weeks." "All of that is true," Frank said. She lifted her head and looked at him. "I just wanted to acknowledge that we are married before we go back to the practical things," she said. He reached up and tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear, and she held very still, her eyes on his. "We are married," he said quietly. "I love you very much. You are the best thing that has happened to me in a long time, possibly ever. And tomorrow we will deal with the barn and the roan and the water rights issue, and we will deal with them together. And that is the most remarkable part of all of it." She looked at him with that open expression that was only his, that was only for him, and then she kissed him once, warmly, and then said against his mouth, "The barn really is going to be a disaster." He laughed, and it rose up from somewhere genuine and easy, and she laughed with him, and the stars above Dry Creek went on doing their extravagant business. The summer of 1879 was a full one. Frank continued his work as deputy, and the 12-mile ride northeast became so regular that Smoke could probably have done it without being directed. Lucy's horse operation was finding its footing. She had 8 animals now, a mix of acquired stock and 2 foals born in late spring, and she had begun the process of establishing a reputation as someone who sold good, reliable working horses to ranchers, and to the occasional Army officer who came through looking for remounts. The reputation grew partly because the horses were genuinely good. Lucy had an eye for what made a useful horse, and she made sound decisions about which animals to breed and which to sell, and partly because Lucy herself was impossible to ignore. She was direct and knowledgeable and fair, and men who came to look at her stock expecting to condescend to a widow operating alone discovered quickly that this was not a productive approach, and the ones who came back after learning that lesson did so with respect and left with good horses. Hector stayed on, and his opinion of Lucy had evolved from professional respect to something that was clearly genuine admiration, which he expressed by continuing to do excellent work and occasionally defending her decisions to other people with a firmness that surprised even him. Billy Carr learned to anticipate what needed to be done before being asked, which Lucy approved of greatly. Frank found that being married changed him in ways he had not fully anticipated. He had always been a thorough and attentive deputy, but there was something different about coming home, because the property was home now, and he had moved out of his rented room in Dry Creek and established himself in the farmhouse with an efficiency that surprised him. There was something different about coming home to a person who was genuinely interested in his day. Not in the performative way of someone asking after a spouse's work because it was expected, but in Lucy's specific way, which was to ask precise questions and expect precise answers, and to say, when he told her about something that went wrong or something difficult, exactly what she thought about it, including when she thought he could have handled it differently. The first time she said that you could have handled that differently, he sat with it for a moment, and she watched him sit with it and did not soften it or take it back. "You are right," he said after the moment. "I know," she said. "I am telling you because I think you are good at this work, and I want you to be better, and I believe you want that too." "I do," he said. "Good," she said, and that was the end of it, except that he did handle the next similar situation differently, and it went better, and he told her so, and she looked very pleased in a way that she was trying not to show too much, but that was entirely visible to him. In September of 1879, Lucy told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening, when they had finished supper and were sitting on the porch, which had been fully repaired, and was now furnished with 2 good chairs and a small table and a lantern that cast a warm circle of light. She said it matter-of-factly because that was her way, and then she watched him with all of her attention. Frank was quiet for a moment that was not a shocked quiet but a full quiet, the kind where you are feeling something so completely that words have to wait their turn. "Lucy," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is," he stopped, started again. "I am very happy," he said simply, because it was true and because in that moment the simplest words were the right ones. She reached over and took his hand. "So am I," she said, and the way she said it measured as always, but underneath the measure absolutely certain, made him understand that she had been sitting with this knowledge for a little while and had been carrying both her feelings and her uncertainty about how he would receive it, and that the relief in her voice was as genuine as the happiness. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am fine," she said. "I am healthy and I feel well and I intend to continue working at a sensible pace for as long as is reasonable." "Of course," he said. "I am not going to become delicate," she said, and there was a slight edge to it like she was anticipating an argument. "I know," he said. "I have met you." She looked at him, and then she laughed and leaned over, and he put his arm around her shoulders and she rested against him, and the lantern burned steadily, and somewhere in the distance a coyote made its evening sound, and Frank Turner sat on the porch of the home he had made with this extraordinary woman and felt, with a completeness he had never expected to have, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The winter of 1879 passed carefully. Lucy did not become delicate, as she had promised, but she and Frank reached a series of quiet, unspoken arrangements about what she would and would not do in the later months of the pregnancy, arrangements that were understood between them without ever being formally discussed, because that was how they worked. They observed each other and adjusted and moved together in the way of people who have learned to understand each other without requiring constant translation. Hector ran the barn with increased independence and did not leave it a disaster, which Lucy noted with satisfaction. Billy Carr developed a genuine skill with the young horses, particularly the two foals, and Lucy began thinking about whether he might have a long-term future in what she was building. Frank had a conversation with Cal Briggs in November about the long-term arrangements of his work. He was thinking about whether the deputy position was sustainable on a long-term basis, alongside the growing demands of the property. And Cal had said, in his direct way, that Frank was the best deputy he had ever had, and that if Frank was thinking of doing something else, Cal would like to know with enough advance notice to find someone who was even half as capable. And if Frank was thinking of staying, Cal would like to know that too. And they could talk about what that looked like as the circumstances changed. Frank had said he was staying. He said it without much deliberation, because the deliberation had already happened privately, and the conclusion was that the work mattered to him, and that he had found a way to be both the deputy and the man building a life on 12 miles of West Texas hill country, and that these were not in conflict but were parts of the same thing. In February of 1880, their son was born. He arrived in the small hours of a cold, clear morning, delivered by the midwife from Carson City, whom Lucy had arranged months in advance with the same organizational thoroughness she applied to everything. Frank was in the house throughout, which was not typical for the time but which he had simply decided was what he was going to do, and nobody who knew Frank Turner was very surprised by this. The baby was healthy and substantial, with dark hair that was clearly his mother's and brown eyes that were, it was early yet, but they seemed to be leaning toward his father's, and he had a quality of focused alertness even in the first hours that struck everyone who saw him as remarkable. They named him William James Turner. William for Lucy's father, who had been a decent and complicated man who had raised an unusual daughter with somewhat more independence than was conventional, and James for Frank's older brother in Missouri, who had died of fever when Frank was 14, and whom Frank had never really stopped missing. Frank held his son in the lamplight of the February morning while Lucy rested, and the midwife stepped out to give them a moment, and he looked at this small, focused, dark-haired person, and felt the exact same quality of complete feeling that he had felt on the porch, the night Lucy told him something too large for words and too certain to need them. "Hello, William," he said very quietly so as not to wake Lucy. "I am very glad you are here. William regarded him with those dark, alert eyes and made a small sound that could have meant anything and which Frank chose to interpret as agreement. Lucy opened her eyes. She had not been asleep after all, only resting. She looked at Frank holding the baby, and her expression was the most unguarded he had ever seen on her face, which was saying a great deal. "He is beautiful," she said, which she said with some surprise, like she had thought she would be more analytical about this and was discovering she was not. "He is," Frank agreed. "He looks like you. He has your jaw," she said. "Babies all look like they have my jaw," Frank said. "That is just how babies look." She laughed tiredly and held out her arms, and he brought their son to her, and she held him with a careful confidence that Frank found completely characteristic of her, even here, even in this. Lucy always held things with care and with intention, never tentatively, and she held her son the same way. The year 1880 grew into something full and good. William was a sound, healthy baby with a determined personality that revealed itself in stages. He was not easily startled. He was deeply interested in things, and he had very clear opinions about what he wanted, which he expressed without hesitation. Lucy said he was exactly like Frank, and Frank said he was exactly like Lucy, and Hector said they were both right and both annoying about it. The horse operation had grown. Lucy now had 15 animals, a genuine breeding program with 2 solid mares that were producing excellent working stock, and a reputation that extended beyond the immediate area to ranchers in 3 counties who came specifically because of the quality. She had hired a second hand, a young woman named Rosa Delgado, whose family had ranched in the Big Bend area for 2 generations, and who had an instinctive understanding of horses that matched Lucy's own, and who became, within the first 6 months, absolutely indispensable. Rosa's presence changed the dynamic of the ranch in a good way. She was 23, practical and sharp, with a quick sense of humor and no patience for things that did not make sense, and she and Lucy worked together with an efficiency that Frank observed with admiration. The injustice of the situation was not lost on him. Rosa was as skilled and knowledgeable as any horse handler in the county, and she would never receive the same recognition for it as a man would have, because that was 1880, and the West was not a fair or equal place, though it could sometimes be a more open one than the cities. Lucy paid Rosa fairly. Frank knew this because Lucy had asked him what fair looked like, and he had told her what he knew about current wages, and she had paid Rosa more than that because, she said, being underpaid for exceptional work was an injustice that she had the power to correct right here in her own operation, so she was correcting it. Frank loved her enormously for that. The spring of 1881 brought a drought warning. The creek was lower than it had been in 4 years, and the grass was thin, and everyone was watching the sky with the anxious attention of people who understood exactly how dependent on water their lives were. The Creston Hills had some natural advantage in water retention, and Lucy's Creek ran from a source high enough in the hills that it was more reliable than the lower ground sources, but it was still lower than comfortable. She and Frank rode the full perimeter of the property one morning in April, checking the creek line and the grass condition, and Lucy was quiet and thinking in the way she got when she was making assessments. "We can reduce the herd by 4 if we need to," she said. "The 3 that are most likely to sell this season, and the old sorrel gelding whose working days are mostly behind him. That reduces the water and pasture demand by enough to be sustainable if the drought deepens." "You have already figured out which 4, Frank said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "I have been thinking about it since January." She paused. "I'm also thinking about whether the creek source can be extended. There is a natural spring above the upper pasture that Hector found 2 years ago that we have not done anything with. If we could channel water from the spring to the upper pasture, we extend the grazing rotation." "That is a significant engineering project," Frank said. "I know," she said, "but it makes the operation better in the long term regardless of the drought. The drought is just the prompt to do something we should have done anyway." This was so entirely like her to take a problem and locate within it the action that solved not only the immediate issue but a future one, that Frank looked at her with the particular mixture of admiration and tenderness that she had been producing in him consistently for 3 years. "Let me talk to Hector about the spring project," he said, "and I will ask around about whether anyone has done something similar in the hills and what the best approach is." "Thank you," she said. And then she looked at him sideways. "You are a very good partner." "So are you," he said. She smiled at the hills in the way of someone who is trying not to show how much they mean something they said. Frank had learned to recognize this and to love it. The spring channel was built over the course of the summer, with Frank and Hector doing much of the physical work on weekends and evenings, and Lucy directing the placement with an attention to gradient and flow that demonstrated she had spent considerable time studying the problem. It worked. By August, the upper pasture had reliable water, and the reduced herd weathered the dry summer in better condition than most operations in the area. They sold 4 horses at good prices, which helped, and by October, when the rains came back and the creek rose to a normal level, Lucy's operation was in better shape than before the drought began. In the autumn of 1881, Frank was offered the position of sheriff. Cal Briggs announced he was retiring at the end of the year. His knees were giving him trouble, and Clara had been asking him to slow down for 2 years, and he had decided she was right, which he admitted cost him something to say but was true. The county commissioner asked Frank directly, and Frank came home and told Lucy and asked her what she thought. "What do you think?" she said. "I am asking you," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to know your answer before I give you mine." He sat with it. "I want it," he said. "I think I can do it well, and I think," he paused, "I think it matters. This county is growing. There are more people, more disputes, more things that need to be handled carefully and honestly. I want to be the person who handles them." "Then take it," she said. "It will mean longer hours sometimes," he said. "And more frank," she said. "I run a horse ranch. I have Hector and Rosa and Billy. William is walking now and has very strong opinions about everything, which he gets from both of us. We will be fine. Take the job." He looked at her. "You are certain?" "I am certain that you should do the work you are meant to do," she said. "And I am certain that this is it. Take the job." He became Sheriff Frank Turner of Garza County in January of 1882, and Cal Briggs retired to Clara and his garden, and Frank wore the badge and did the work with exactly the care and honesty that Cal had hoped for and that the county needed. Dry Creek continued to grow. A second general store opened. A school was built, which was a significant development, and which Lucy had strong opinions about and attended the planning meetings for, which resulted in 3 specific improvements to the proposed curriculum that the school board adopted, somewhat to their own surprise, because Lucy was persuasive in the particular way of someone who has done all of their research and presents it clearly and without excessive emotion. She also donated a set of books from her personal collection, including 2 that had never been available in the county before, and that the teacher, a young woman named Ellen Park from San Antonio, was visibly moved by. William started at that school in the fall of 1886, at 6 years old, and went in with the focused attention of a child who has grown up in a household where ideas were taken seriously, and questions were not only allowed but expected. He had Frank's steadiness and Lucy's directness, and a curiosity that was entirely his own, and within 2 months, his teacher had written a note home saying he was one of the most engaged students she had encountered, which Lucy read twice and then put carefully in the small wooden box where she kept the things that mattered. In the spring of 1884, Lucy had told Frank she was expecting again. He had been sitting at the kitchen table going over some papers from the county commissioner, and she had come in from the barn still in her work clothes, and sat down across from him with the particular directness that meant she had something to say. "We are going to have another child," she said. Frank set down his papers. He looked at her face, which was completely composed and entirely alive with feeling underneath the composure. "Good," he said, because it was, completely and without reservation. She smiled. It was the warm, full smile, the one that had no composure in it at all. "Good," she agreed. Their daughter was born in November of 1884. She arrived in a hurry, unlike William, who had been methodical even about being born. She arrived at noon on a clear November day and immediately demonstrated what would be a lifelong tendency to make her presence known in every room she entered. They named her Clara Josephine Turner. Clara for Cal Briggs's wife, who had been kind to Frank in the years before he met Lucy and whom they both loved. Josephine for one of Lucy's sisters, who had been the one person who told Lucy the horse ranch was a good idea and who deserved to be remembered for that. Clara was a bright, loud, joyful child who followed horses with the focused devotion of her mother from the time she could walk, and who had opinions about everything with the confidence of her father, and who Hector Reyes declared, the first time she tottered into the barn and sat down in the hay and looked at the horses with an expression of serious evaluation, was going to be a very interesting person. He was not wrong. By the late 1880s, the Lawson-Turner Ranch, which was how most people referred to it, though the deed said Lawson and Frank had never once suggested it should be otherwise, was one of the best-regarded horse operations in West Texas. Lucy had grown it from 3 horses and a broken fence to 25 animals, a solid breeding program, a reliable market with ranchers across 4 counties, and a standing arrangement with an Army remount station that kept business consistent even in years when the private market was slow. Rosa Delgado was still there and had been given a share in the operation, which Lucy had arranged in 1885 with the same matter-of-fact directness with which she arranged everything, telling Rosa that she had earned it and that it was the right thing, and that there was no reason to make a fuss about it. Rosa had said it was a very large thing. Lucy had said yes, it was, which is why she was doing it, and had put the papers on the table, and Rosa had signed them, and Lucy had shaken her hand, and that had been that. Billy Carr had built his own small operation adjacent to the Lawson-Turner land, specializing in training, and he and Lucy had a working arrangement that benefited both of them. He was 28 now and married and had a baby of his own, and he occasionally brought the baby to visit William and Clara, who treated the baby with the solemn interest of children who take everything seriously. Hector Reyes was 62 and had been talking about slowing down for 3 years without actually slowing down, because the horses still needed daily management, and he still knew things that no one else knew, and he could not quite bring himself to step fully back from something that was working so well. Lucy had told him that he could slow down whenever he chose, and that there would always be a role for him here, and that his salary would not change regardless of how many hours he worked. And Hector had looked at her with the expression he sometimes had when she said something that moved him and said she was a remarkable woman, and she had said she was a practical one, and he had said those were the same thing. In the summer of 1889, Frank Turner sat on the porch of the house in the Crestone Hills on a Saturday evening in July, watching the last light go golden over the hills, and listening to the sounds of the property around him, horses in the pasture, Clara singing to herself somewhere near the barn in a manner that suggested she was conducting a private concert for the animals, William's voice and Rosa's voice in conversation near the fence line. The distant sound of a creek running full and clear in a good water year. Lucy came out and sat beside him in the chair that had been her chair for a decade now, the worn one with the good back and the arm that creaked slightly when you put weight on it in a particular way, and she had 2 cups of coffee, one of which she handed to him. The coffee was still very strong. She had gotten better at many things over the years. The coffee had remained entirely itself, and Frank had long since stopped thinking of this as a flaw and understood it instead as a feature, because it was made by Lucy, and she made it the way she made everything with complete intention and no apology. "Good day," she said, looking at the hills. Very good, he agreed. Rosa thinks the bay stallion is ready for the Johnson Ranch evaluation, she said. She wants to take him in next week. Rosa is usually right about those things, Frank said. She always is, Lucy said. I want her to go. I might go with her. I have not been to the Johnson Ranch since March. I will manage things here, Frank said. She looked at him sideways in the evening light. Her hair had some gray in it now, at the temples, which she wore the same way she wore everything without apology and with a kind of unself-conscious dignity. She was 37 years old, and she was, Frank thought with the private certainty of 11 years, the most impressive person he had ever known. I never thought I would be here, she said. When I walked into your office in 1878 and you were the only person in that building who did not tell me to go home. You did not look like someone who needed to be told to go home, he said. You said something like that once before, she said. Almost exactly. I mean it the same way, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The evening birds were starting, and the light was dropping toward rose and copper, and Clara had apparently concluded her concert because her voice had moved from singing to something more conversational, which meant she was talking to the horses, which was something she had been doing since she could talk at all. I was afraid, Lucy said quietly. When I first came here, I did not say it then and I barely let myself know it, but I was. Thomas had died and I had some money and a land claim and a very incomplete skill set, and I was 26 years old and I wanted desperately to build something real and I was not sure I could. Frank listened. He always listened. You did not treat my uncertainty like weakness, she said. You treated it like information. You just found me the right people and told me what you could tell me and then let me do what I was going to do. That was the thing I needed. Not someone to protect me or manage me. Someone to stand alongside and tell the truth. That is all I was doing, Frank said. No, she said. It was more than that. It was, she paused and her voice was careful with something she wanted to say exactly right. It was respect. Real respect, the kind that does not need to announce itself. And I had not had that before, not fully. And it changed what I thought was possible. Frank set down his coffee and reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it that first morning by the roan mare's fence, and she laced her fingers through his with the ease of long habit that was not habit at all but chosen comfort, selected every time. You would have built it anyway, he said. With or without me. You would have found a way. Probably, she said, but it would not have been this. This is, she looked at the hills, the pasture, the barn golden in the last light. This is more than I thought it would be. Me too, Frank said. Clara came around the barn at a run, all energy and direction, her dark hair loose and her boots muddy, and she stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at them with the expression of someone who has important news. Mama, she said, the roan's foal is standing up. Lucy was on her feet in an instant, coffee abandoned, and Frank was 1 second behind her, and they followed their daughter across the yard in the golden evening to the foaling stall where a new horse, just hours old, was making its first determined attempt at standing in the way that foals did, all long legs and concentrated effort and refusal to be discouraged by falling. William was already there, standing very still with Rosa beside him, watching. The mother mare was attentive and calm, nosing her foal gently at each attempt. The foal fell twice more and then, on the fourth try, found its feet and stood, trembling slightly but upright, and the whole family and Rosa stood quietly in the barn and watched this small, new, determined animal claim its place in the world. Lucy reached for Frank's hand without looking, and he gave it, and Clara pressed against Lucy's side, and William stood straight and still with the dignity of a 9-year-old who is feeling things but managing them carefully. And Rosa smiled at the foal with the satisfaction of someone who has seen this 100 times and is moved by it every single time. Frank looked at his wife's face in the dim warmth of the barn, the complete attention, the pleasure, the quiet wonder that she only let show when she forgot, briefly, to hold anything back. And he thought about the morning he had walked into his office, and a dusty, bruised, undefeated woman had walked through the door and changed everything. He had not known that morning that this was where it was going. He had not known that asking whether she could fight would be the beginning of something that would fill his life so entirely that he could no longer clearly remember what it had felt like before her. The way you cannot remember what it felt like before knowing a piece of music you cannot imagine not knowing. The foal took its first uncertain steps, and Clara made a sound of pure delight and grabbed Lucy's hand. And Lucy looked down at her daughter with a smile so unguarded, it was almost light. And Frank put his arm around his wife's shoulders and felt the warmth of her, present and certain and home. Outside the barn, the Texas sky was all stars, the way it always was in those hills on a clear night, extravagant and close and full of everything. The creek ran in the dark. The horses moved in the pasture. Dry Creek sat 12 miles to the southwest, going about its business. And here on this land that Lucy Lawson had decided to claim and Frank Turner had helped her hold, a new thing was standing for the first time, finding its legs, deciding to stay. As all the best things do. They stood together in the warmth and the lamplight until the foal had nursed and settled, and the children's energy finally turned toward supper and sleep, and Rosa said her good nights and walked to her quarters with the easy pace of someone who belongs entirely where they are. And then it was just the two of them, Frank and Lucy, walking back to the house in the dark with the stars overhead and the familiar sounds of the ranch around them. At the porch steps, Lucy stopped and tilted her head back and looked up at the sky with that look she had, the one that was just looking fully without needing anything from it. "What are you thinking?" Frank asked. "That it is a very good sky," she said. "It is," he said. She lowered her head and looked at him, and her eyes caught the light from the lamp on the porch, and she was entirely herself, clear-eyed, decided, direct, and more beloved to him than he had words for. "Come inside, Sheriff," she said. He followed her in, and the door closed behind them, and the lamp in the window burned warm against the dark, and the stars went on above the Crestone Hills. The creek went on in the dark, and the ranch went on being exactly what a determined woman and the man who knew to ask whether she could fight had built it to be, real and solid and good and full of love, and entirely, completely theirs.